So I stand here before you today with glasses on. Sometimes I wear contacts. For a long time in my life, I only wore contacts. I mean, there was a time where I didn't even really have glasses, so I had no choice. But then I ran out of contacts, and I started wearing glasses, and now I can't hardly go back. I mean, they switched me to a different kind. I don't know. I wear them sometimes because it's nice not having everything on my head. But I've had glasses since I was in 7th grade, and I remember distinctly when I got them. I knew I needed them before I went to the eye doctor, and that was because I had friends who had glasses, and for whatever reason, we'd be at school, and I would have their glasses and just look through them, and I realized that I could see better. And I'm like, okay, well, there's something not right here. And finally, I went and I got glasses of my own. And I remember that first time coming out of the eye doctor and then riding home. And it was like the world just came alive again. And I'll just say, my eyes aren't terrible. They are definitely to the level where I have to have glasses to drive by law, but I could definitely drive okay without them. But my dad and even Megan, who both their eyes are way worse than mine. So I couldn't imagine having eyes like theirs where you literally can't see anything. And then all of a sudden you get glasses and it's like the world comes alive. But what I remember most is we were driving home and I could just see things. I could see the leaves on the trees. It was like the world was more vibrant. It was like all of a sudden I could see clearly. Now, maybe you've had this experience, but I also have heard from people who have had cataract removed that they've had a similar experience, where it was like the world was just kind of dull and gray, and then they get the cataract removed and all of a sudden they can just see vibrant colors, and it's like the life comes back into the world. Both of these experiences are about seeing the world clearly. So I want you to think about today, how do you see the world? And I'm not talking about how do you see it with your eyes. I mean, yes, we want to be able to see well, but how do you perceive the world? What is it that you value? What is it that matters? What are you trying to accomplish? How do you define success? What drives you to have certain goals? What we don't realize that underneath all of these goals and desires, they're framed by assumptions. Things that we inherit from life and from our culture, things that we think are important, and they become part of our values and how we see the world. Now, if you don't believe me, in our readings for today, we see examples of this. We see it in every single reading that we read. Well, specifically the two stories. The story in Samuel and the story in John. We see people living by their assumptions and how those assumptions influence the world. So we're going to look at a couple of these stories today, just bits and pieces, to see what it's inviting us to see about God. So here in a minute, we're going to look at the story in 1 Samuel, just a couple of the verses again. But before we get there, just a reminder that in this 1 Samuel story, we're reading God tell Samuel, who was a prophet, he's saying, okay, I want you to go and I want you to anoint a new king for Israel. But what we might forget is that Israel already had a king. They had a king whenever Samuel is going to anoint a new king. And at the very beginning of that story, it's the king's mentioned, Saul. So Saul was the king, and all of a sudden Samuel is anointing a new king. So that is dangerous for Samuel, because if Saul finds out, he's going to try to stop it. But before we look at what happens with Samuel, let's look at what it says about Saul. So this is how Saul is described in 1 Samuel, just a couple chapters before. There was a Benjaminite, a man of standing whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zeor, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphialah of Benjamin. So that's just all the different family line of Saul. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel. And he was a head taller than anyone else. So we get these important details whenever we meet Saul for the very first time. We hear, first of all, that he was handsome. He was good looking. Now, I think it is true in life that often good looking people just seem to get along better. Now, if you don't believe me, there's a sports talk guy named Colin Cowherd. He does sports media. If you don't know who he is, it doesn't matter. He has this theory that NFL quarterbacks are good looking because if you just think about the average quarterback or think about like Tom Brady, who's like the pinnacle of quarterbacks, and like how his life has progressed. Why is it that quarterbacks tend to be good looking? Well, his theory is because good looking people get more attention. People like to support them. And so that means that these quarterbacks from a young age have an advantage. And that's why they end up becoming good quarterbacks. I don't know if that's true. I don't think you look at every quarterback and say that they're really good looking. I mean, Peyton Manning was a pretty average looking guy. He had his big old forehead. But that's what Colin Cowherd said. But definitely in life, someone like Saul with his good looks had an advantage. But on top of that, it wasn't just that he looked good. Notice what else it says about Saul. He was a head taller than everybody else. He stood out in the crowd. He was massive. He was a tall person. Now, in the ancient world, people were just shorter than the average of today. And so for him to be a head taller, he stuck out. So he looks the part of a king. When people see Saul, they say, that guy is different. I would follow him. He's good looking, he's big, he's the kind of person who leads a country. So Saul had what it took by human standards to be a good king. So as we have this in our mind, we need to look at what Samuel sees when he goes to see David's family. Because he arrives and they don't know why he's there, but he starts to meet some of David's brothers. Now let's look at what it says about the first brother he meets. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands before me. Because Samuel looked at Eliab and something about him said, this is a king. And it was just because he was looking at him. Just like the rest of Israel looked at Saul and said, you look like a king. This is what kings look like. You have the features that we think are important for a king. Eliab is there and he has those features. But this is what God says about that. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So we already see that Samuel is going off of the assumptions of his culture. What does a king look like? Well, they're tall and handsome. They're powerful looking. They're influential. And these two guys looked like kings. But God says, I don't look at the outside. I mean, God already did that once. He gave them the king they thought they wanted in Saul. And things went wrong. If you notice, it's only 3 chapters after Saul was anointed. So in 3 chapters, he's already failed in the book of Samuel. And God is moving on to the next king. Here's what we need to see. The world judges through fitness of royalty are based on external factors. Someone's looks, someone's appearance. But God looks at internal factors. He considers the heart and the integrity of the person. So we have the world values and we have God's values, and they don't always align. And in this case, Samuel, the prophet of God, is guilty of the same thing that the rest of Israel is. Now let's keep that in mind, because now we're going to look at this story from John. We're just going to look at a couple of these key details in John again to see how Jesus' disciples make the very same kind of assumptions as Samuel about this man. So let's look here at this passage again. So let's look at the first couple of verses. So as Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. So just to set the context, they're just walking, and there's a blind man there. And so his disciples ask him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So they are repeating an assumption. And the assumption in the ancient world was, if you had some sort of like disability or illness, it was often the assumption that that was because of a sin that you committed, or it was punishment for a sin of a family member, usually a parent. So the assumption was, if a parent had a child with a birth defect or some sort of ailment, they must have sinned. And this man, we don't know when he became blind. Maybe it was later in life. But someone caused this to happen. And so they're asking Jesus. They have this assumption about the world. And this is what Jesus says in verse 3. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. So Jesus says, look, I know that's what you hear and that's what people think, But I need you to put aside the assumptions of the world, and I want you to look to me. That's what he's saying to us. He's like, I want you to look to me to know how to see the world. All those values and assumptions that you have over here, you need to look to me to make sure that they line up with the way that I've made you to live. Put away those assumptions. So that was the disciples. Look at the religious leaders. Verse 13, they're supposed to be the ones leading the people. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. And he said, he put mud on my eyes, and the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. So you see that even within the Pharisees, there was division about who Jesus was, because some said, look, we see this before us, a guy was healed of blindness. But others said, well, he can't be from God because he made some mud on the Sabbath. He violated what they said it meant to keep Sabbath. And so they said, we don't think that Jesus is this guy from God. They weren't seeing him clearly. They were questioning him because of one assumption that they already had. They had an assumption of what it meant to keep Sabbath. And because he broke it, they said, surely he can't be from God. So that's the Pharisees. Now this is the man who was healed. This is what he says about Jesus. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he is a prophet. A second time they summoned the man. So this is later. Remember, there's in between, they talked to his parents who have been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth. They said, we know this man is a sinner. And this is what he says back. He says, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. So again, we see the Pharisees respond to Jesus and how it's different than the blind man. The blind man says, you know what? I was blind and now I see. This man changed my life. Even though maybe he didn't follow all the assumptions of our people, he's from God. He's a prophet. And the Pharisees said he can't be from God because he broke our rules. He goes against our assumptions. How we respond to Jesus matters. And Jesus wants to know how the man's going to respond to him, just like he wants to know how we're going to respond to him. So this is what he says to the blind man a little bit later. Jesus heard that they had thrown the man out, and that means they threw him out of the synagogue, basically says you can't come back anymore. And when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe. And that's the man, worshiped Jesus. So Jesus goes to the man and he says, okay, I heard this has happened to you. So now I'm going to test your faith. Or do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man's very open. He says, if I knew who that was, yes. And Jesus says, I am him. And the man responds. He believes in Jesus. And so this is how the man responds. And then this is what Jesus says to the Pharisees in 39. Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him ask this, and they said, what, are we blind too? And Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now what you claim, you can see. But now that you claim to see, your guilt remains. And so here's what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees. He's saying, how you see me matters. And because you're making a judgment about me, you're all of a sudden making a decision. And you're choosing to remain blind. And by choosing to remain blind, you are not innocent. Because truly blind people just don't know. But you are choosing to reject me, so you're rejecting God. And you're rejecting my way, and you're rejecting salvation. How do you see Jesus? We should be following Jesus' words, what he says about himself, what he invites us to do, how he invites us to live, how he calls us to live. That's how we should see the world. And you might be wondering, okay, what does all this look like? Well, if we just look at a couple of these verses from Paul, we see it all come together. So Paul says, for you were once in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth, and find out what pleases the Lord. And so the first thing that Paul is saying here to the church in Ephesus is he's saying, you were people of darkness, but now you are people of light. Living in the light is like putting on glasses for the first time. It's like having those cataracts removed. It's like turning on the lights in a dark cave. Any of those images we've talked about before today, it's about seeing the world the way it was meant to be seen. We must leave the darkness and embrace the light of Jesus. We must come to terms that we're apart from God and that we need to come back to him. And to do so, it means we have to leave the darkness and come into the light. To leave a world that is all messed up and broken and shattered that we don't see clearly, and to put on the glasses that Jesus gives us to find life. And then Paul says this to close out. He says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light. This is why it is said, wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Paul is calling them into the light. We must be people who live in the light. We must leave the darkness and embrace the light of Jesus. So we're now in the 4th week of Lent. We've got this full week, next Sunday and the week after. Those are all weeks of Lent. And then we get to Holy Week. And that's where things really start to speed up. We're on this journey towards Mount Calvary. And Lent forces us to see the darkness that's all around us. It pushes us to recognize the lies the world encourages us to believe. Some of the things we read in the 10 best ways, the world sees those as values. What do you think social media is? It's looking at other people's lives and wanting their lives. And it's actually people on there telling you a fake version of their lives so that you want to be them. And that's how people make money today. That's what drives our culture. And it's built on lies. We need to leave those lies behind and embrace the light of Jesus. Lent points to the sin all around us, and it demands that we make a choice. We can either see the world as God made it, or we can believe the lies. But if you've ever heard how influencers actually live, the debt that they're in, the lack of fulfillment, the lives that are crumbling, you realize that that's a lie. It's all smoke and mirrors. Instead, we must leave the darkness and embrace the light of Jesus. Just like putting glasses on the first time or having cataracts removed, we need to see the world clearly. So my invitation for you today is to put these glasses on to see the world as Jesus sees it. Embrace him and embrace the person he claims to be. It came down to the Pharisees or the blind man. And the blind man, when he decided to choose Jesus, they threw him out. They said, you're no longer one of us. But he said, you know what? It doesn't matter because I'm going to embrace Jesus. Now, we don't face that sort of scrutiny. But yes, we will have to leave behind something that might look good on the outside. But when you get into it, when you get to the underbelly of whatever the world tells us is a good life, we see lots of broken, hurt people who are unfulfilled. And we're invited to leave the darkness and embrace the light of Jesus. So as Lent continues, we must leave the darkness and embrace the light of Jesus. We must choose life. We must choose to live in the light. We must choose Jesus.